everyone. It's been 3 years now that I started making videos, and I haven't had the opportunity to actually talk about the inner child or inner child healing yet. And it is one of the cornerstones of my work as a therapist and as a guide, so I guess everything is a matter of divine timing, and now is the right time to talk about it. So in this video I'll be talking about my own experience with inner child healing. And I will talk about traumas, about wounds, and about dissociation, and why it's so important to address this subject in these times of planetary ascension. When I did my training in hypnosis 8 years ago, I actually experienced myself and had solid proof that most of the problems that we have as an adult, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, they all find their roots in childhood, because all the memories from childhood that we have are deeply stored into our subconscious mind and our emotional bodies. And with what we call age regression in hypnosis, we can reconnect to those memories, to those traumas. And there are several types of traumas. There is physical trauma, psychological trauma, and emotional trauma. And whether we grew up in a violent environment or not, whether we went to war or not, we all experience trauma growing up. We all have what we call post-traumatic stress. Regardless the nature of the trauma, all traumas fall in the group of emotional trauma. And why is that? Because a child between the age of 0 and 7 only lives on an emotional level. He doesn't have a rational mind that is formed yet, so he has no way of actually giving meaning to what he experiences. He's only experiencing it on an emotional level. And we live in a society that does not know how to embrace emotions and has a kind of tendency to even reject some sorts of emotions. So when a child actually feels an emotion that is not reflected by his environment, by his parents, that is not validated, that is often rejected, what he will learn is actually to block and suppress that emotion. And that emotion will not go away. It will remain stuck into his subconscious mind, into his emotional body, under the form of a trauma. So we can easily imagine that when this pattern is repeated again and again, what will happen is that the child, since what he feels does not find a positive resonance in his environment, so for example when his parents reject the emotion or actually shame him for having the emotion or just don't validate it, the child will over time start feeling completely isolated from his environment, from the rest of the world, and he will start to shame himself for actually feeling the emotion and will think that the problem is actually inside of him. And so this will really create over time a kind of personality and identity that is completely fragmented and suppressed. Sometimes trauma can also come from things, not that things that were done to a child, but things that were not done or given to a child, and we call that emotional neglect. And emotional neglect can be really as violent as any kind of visible violence that can exist. And I think this is a subject that I will address more in depth in another video, because I think it's also very important to understand what it is exactly. The trauma creates a real fracture in our being, and a child, when he experiences trauma, he will learn to develop a survival mechanism that we call dissociation. And dissociation, very often we think, is an out-of-body experience, but that's not always the case. I would say that there is an out-of-body experience when the child experiences a very heavy and extreme physical trauma, such as physical violence, but also, of course, sexual abuse. And of course, as I said earlier, physical trauma is always mingled with emotional trauma. So there, in this case, since the pain is so heavy to bear in the body, there will be a dissociation that leads to an out-of-body experience. But most of the time, we can dissociate ourselves without leaving the body. It's just that we are desensitizing ourselves from the scene that we are experiencing when we are children. So for example, if we are experiencing something difficult that we cannot cope with, we are simply going to dissociate, and it's as if our consciousness is going to go elsewhere while we are still kind of in the scene. So we are there, but without being completely there. We all learned to dissociate when we were children because sometimes it was the only way to cope with the reality that we were experiencing. So what happens when we become adults and we dissociated a lot, we could have the feeling that we are not really present, we're not really grounded, we're always mind wandering or actually escaping with our minds, so it's the kind of the daydreamer, not really present in our life, always absent. And that's because if we feel absent and not present, that's literally because there are parts of ourselves that are not there. There are parts of ourselves that are blocked in our past. Because every time we experience a trauma and we dissociate, it's like there is a fragment of ourselves that splits and stays stuck in the moment when the trauma happened. And this trauma is kind of stuck on a loop, so it's like a broken record, and that's why we will always kind of re-experience over again the same emotions, the same situations, we will attract the same people and the same patterns. So we can imagine that we are scattered in several pieces, and since the dawn of time, shamans have practiced what we call soul retrieval, which is to seek out all these fragments of all these pieces of trauma and bring them back into the body of the person for reintegration. And every time we experience a trauma, there is our identity that is formed around the trauma. So our ego actually forms around the trauma. This is why we could say that we create multiple personalities or alter egos every time that we experience a trauma. So in a sense, we are multiple, and we know that we are multidimensional, but we are also multiple personalities as a human being. A few years ago I went through difficult times. I really experienced a very intense healing crisis where a lot of traumas came up, a lot of wounds came up, and when actually the emotions of a trauma come up, it's as if you are re-experiencing the trauma. So I've done a video called Huge Shift where I actually tell a little bit about my story, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. If you haven't watched it, then maybe you can watch that video. And what happened for me then was that, of course, the first thing you do when you are triggered emotionally and you re-experience trauma is that you're going to project on the external world, outside world. But very quickly I started feeling very alone. I had no one to hold my hand through the process. I was trying to seek external guidance, but that didn't work out because I was always disappointed. So really what life wanted me to do was to confront me with myself and actually figure the thing out and do the work on my own. And that's what happened. So instead of seeking something outside or instead of resisting what I was feeling, I actually went really within and I started to really go deep within. So I really let myself go very, very deep into the emotion that I felt. And as I did that, as I really relaxed deeply into what I was feeling, I started to make what we call spontaneous regressions. So I was spontaneously brought back to when the trauma was anchored. And the first one that I experienced was my very first trauma as a fetus in my mother's womb, and that was the rejection wound. My parents wanted to have a boy, and when they knew that I was a girl, there was a lot of disappointment, and I could feel their disappointment, and that triggered a feeling of not wanting to be there anymore, of wanting to die, to disappear, and an immense sadness. So I re-experienced that feeling, and then I actually took care of the fetus. I actually embraced the fetus and sent love to it and started to comfort it. So that's when I found out that I could really actually develop a real relationship with that part of myself. We are often told that we must love ourselves, that we must learn to love ourselves, and that is a crucial part of our journey, that's for sure. But the problem is that we all understand it in theory, but we don't know how to do it practically. And by doing this process, I re-experience a lot of intense emotions, because every time you reintegrate a trauma, you actually relive the emotion, because you have to reintegrate the emotion into your body. So it's a pretty intense process. But what really helped me is that I started building this this very real love relationship with my inner child. And with that relationship, there was a kind of trust that was built as well. So this really helped me to understand that self-love actually starts with loving this inner child inside of ourselves. So I gradually started to feel reassured, and I gradually started to feel this love grow inside of me, because I was sending this love to this inner child. It was helping me to build my own self-love and sending love to all these parts of myself that really needed it in the end. So I went from someone who really saw herself as a worthless piece of shit to someone who has a kind of decent self-esteem. And that's thanks to this process. So I started to actually integrate this process into my therapy work with other people. And I actually started to create my own process, and I called it the emotional intuitive therapy, because of course it's completely intuitive, but also because we actually liberate all these suppressed and blocked emotions and traumas. So what happens is that actually we become a mother and a father to our inner child, and what this creates is that the inner child feels reassured, and so the inner child will lead us and becomes the key to our own healing journey, and it's like the inner child becomes our guide. And I can already tell you that I will probably write a book about this subject, because I think it's really important to get the information out there. It's really important to teach people how to build this solid foundation of self-love within them through this building of the relationship with the inner child and the integration of all the shadow aspects. So, as I always say to people that I work with, there is no miracle recipe. I can give you the keys, I can show you somehow the way to get there, but then it's up to each and every one to actually take responsibility of their own life and their own destiny, because my goal is to really make people very independent very quickly, and certainly not dependent upon me or anything. Everyone has the keys to his own destiny and his own healing, and nobody can do the work besides yourself. So the work being, of course, integrating all the shadow aspects and starting to build this relationship with the inner child that will lead to more self-love and self-care. Each time we release a trauma, we actually change the past, because we release the information that was stuck in the emotional body, in the subconscious mind. And every time we do that, we instantly change our vibration. So we raise our vibration every time we release a trauma. So I know that there are a lot of people out there who always want to raise their vibration. They always seek different techniques, different tools to do so. But I can tell you that one of the most effective ways to raise your vibration is to actually do the shadow work and practice self-love, so loving the inner child. It is a shamanic, quantum and transgenerational work as well, because what happens is that we begin with the child, with the inner child, and we end up with the ancestors and the whole family lineages. So it's not uncommon, for example, during a session that we are visited by an ancestor that needs some healing. And what happens is that when you free the child, when you free yourself, you actually contribute to free the entire family line. So imagine doing that on a global scale. When we do this work, we actually contribute to free entire generations of traumas that were passed on to generation. So it's a huge work, a huge healing work that we're actually doing, and it is really crucial to be doing this work in these times of ascension on this planet, as I was saying in the beginning. So by changing yourself, by freeing yourself and your inner child, you are helping to free all your ancestral line, all your family line, and helping to free humanity on a global scale of all the traumas that were passed on from generation to generation. Whenever we release a trauma, we are actually releasing and freeing our inner child in its most purest and innocent aspect. Because every time we release a trauma, we actually let go of a part of our false identity. So it's like a part of our ego is going to die every time we release a trauma. Because as I said before, the ego forms around the trauma. So that's why sometimes we will feel resistance or we will feel blockages when we do the process. But it's really like removing all the stones to the path that leads to our true selves, to our soul. Because a child is naturally joyful, spontaneous, creative, inspired, because it is our soul that is expressing itself through him. So when we honor our children, our inner children, and when we do the work, so by reintegrating all the shadow aspects and healing our wounds, then we can find again this childlike and divine essence that we truly are. And it's almost like we can become children again, but with the wisdom and the maturity of someone that takes responsibility for his own destiny. And I will end with a word from Yeshua on this subject. Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Satnam.